once we get access to a system, there is something called post-exploitation, and that is the concept of, well, what do we do once we've got that initial access into something, whether it's a server, whether it's a host, and typically it kind of falls into, well, uh, firstly, we have to define that with the actual scope engagement. So always going to have to validate what our risks are, and then the target versus that attack machine, right? So if we go away and we exploit something and it's successful, now what do, right? And it's privilege escalation, right? So is priv-esque being that main focus point for a post exploitation? And sometimes it may be, right? So in this post exploit triangle, we're going to talk all things around post exploitation. We'll talk about pivoting, and then we'll talk about persisting. I'm going to keep this as high level as possible with giving enough information as I can possibly do on each bit of the area. So anytime we start talking about post-exploitation, the first thing that we want to do here is obviously look for the value, right? So traditionally, loot, right? We want to look and investigate for sensitive data, sensitive users. Can we priv-esque or privilege escalate into that? Chances are, anytime we get initial access into a machine, we may have a low level account of some sort, right? And then we'll have to priv-esque into maybe an admin or a root or maybe an enterprise admin. And we have to privilege escalate our way into that really domain account. So depending on what path of privilege escalation we go into, and there's a bunch of different ways and tools to priv-esque on Windows and priv-esque on, on Linux and stuff like that. And we can talk about those at a later video or another segment altogether, because you can really spend time and time and time and time talking about ways to persist and pivot and post-exploit Windows environments, and the same thing we can do with Windows. So typically, exploitation or post-exploitation is anytime we want to do something after we get access to something, right? So is this now viewing information for DNS records? Is it ARP information? Is it groups and users, right? Could it be routing? If we then need to pivot and use certain tool sets to pivot, which we'll talk about in just a moment, what services are running? If we then have to persist into a certain service that's running, we need to know what they are. So we need to then look around, investigate, we have to maybe screenshot or keylog, or, there's a bunch of stuff we can then do in different tool sets that can help us do all these kinds of things once we've got that initial access into that host. The other part here, when we start talking about post-exploitation, is pivoting. Pivoting kind of happens at any given point, right? Because anytime we've exploited a service on our host, then we have that connection, right? And then that idea of pivoting essentially is using that host to then pivot through other machines or get it to do the other stuff. So if we've got persistence, or we've got, I should say, initial access, I'm going to say post-exploit on this host over here. And then we're sort of targeting, maybe this is a HR person's machine because we've done enough recon to know they operate on a certain subnet. And then that HR subnet has reachability into maybe other areas. Well, then we're going to then try and get post or initial access onto this machine, and then pivot with having access to that person's machine, because then chances are they've got access to these other subnets that we don't have access to, and or whatever the main reason is, right? So we're looking for those vulnerabilities across the infrastructure, again, across the workstations, the servers, and obviously defining what that goal of the pen test is. Now, if pivoting is part of that actual scope, we have to heavily define how we're going to pivot and what machines we're going to pivot. And again, going into our comms plan, when I say here comms, all the time should be a default process, because you're going to have to then communicate to the stakeholders that we did in fact get access to HR or someone's machine, and we're now pivoting through the infrastructure. And then if they've got certain controls, and if you're control validating those controls and the responses of those controls, then we're going to have a discussion around other certain controls picking you up doing your pivoting, or you're doing your certain tool sets or your certain certain services that you're abusing to pivot. So just keep that in mind right? So that's pretty much it when we talk about pivoting. We're kind of using that machine's resources now to then gain access to larger parts of the business or infrastructure. And finally, when we're talking about persistence down here, as I said, I'm going to keep this very simple and very high level because I want this to be a very conceptual understanding of each of these areas. Pivoting and persisting, highly common. Persistence, just think about this as a backdoor, right? Now, if we've gone through that exploit phase and then we've gone to a pivot phase and now we've gone, okay, so this is our machine here. This is us, right? A nice little happy face. So I'm going to say us is here. And then we've maybe got initial access to a web server. So this is a www server of some sort. So we have initial access here. And then from somewhere or somehow we've got access to another machine. Chances are we don't want to go through those holes, those hoops again to get to this machine. So you want to then persist on either both of these machines. So then you have that access if these machines do reboot, for example, or they've gone through an update of some sort, if they're logged off, they've logged back in, or something happens in terms of rebooting or restarting that machine, we want to then persist. So we may have to put a bit of code or a bit of stuff in a startup file. So when the machine starts up, it's going to look in the startup drive, and then we can have some sort of abuse function on that startup function or in the registry keys that when that machine starts up again, then we can have connection back into that part of the process and we don't lose any bits and processes across that chain, and then we have to start everything all over again. So when we talk about persistence, it's persisting into that infrastructure and always having access should we get disconnected, right? Which we don't want to get disconnected. We don't want to lose what we have. So we want to have to obviously persist and get access to different services and functions to always have access to that host. I hope you found this video handy. As always, I'll see you in the next video. And if there's anything else you'd like me to explain or talk about, please let me know. As always, see you in the next video.